Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Toolkits Graphic Narratives Live in Conversation. My name is Bailey Sharp. I'll be facilitating the session today. I'm calling in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I know our guest Meg O'Shea is also sitting tonight. So on behalf of ourselves and for everyone in the session who is also sitting on any stolen Indigenous lands across this continent, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people who are watching today's discussion. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So tonight is the second of two conversations that we've hosted this week with people intimately involved in Australian comics. Last night I spoke with David Golding, who is a senior editor at Scribe Publications. You can find that talk archived on this channel if you missed it. And tonight I'll be speaking with Meg O'Shea. So Meg O'Shea is a comic maker, educator, research assistant based in Sydney on Gadigal and Wangal Country. She makes largely autobiographical and nonfiction work that has been published both locally and overseas. She's exhibited comic, animation, and film work internationally, and taught comic making to university students, high school age students from migrant and refugee backgrounds with the STARTS program, and art programs to elementary age students in Korea. As part of the Folio research project, she also assists in mapping, archiving, and promoting contemporary Australian comics and the diverse artists and communities that created them. I'd also like to add to that Meg is also one of the new co-facilitators of the Comic Arts Workshop, which I intend for us to talk to later tonight. So thank you, Meg, for being here. But before we start, I'll just give a little bit more context on what we're doing here. So I'm the facilitator of this season of the graphic narrative stream of the Toolkits program. I'm a cartoonist myself with a background in sort of zine making and self-publishing. And I've taught comics and other related courses at universities over the last few years. I'm also a co-administrator of Glom Press, which is a risograph comics publisher and for-hire printer. We're located in Narm. And this program that we're here for tonight, Toolkits Connect, is a 12-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in an online environment. Toolkits is run by Express Media, and Express has been around for over 30 years, developing, supporting, promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills and through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, such as their great flagship publication, VoiceWorks, and through awards and programs that recognize excellence. So Toolkits Connect is generously supported by the Copyright Cultural Fund. This session, once we're finished, will be available on YouTube as a resource. It'll also be captioned in the coming days. If you'd like to ask any questions for the live viewers, you can do that in the chat. We may take questions as they arise, or we may save some for the end, depending on kind of what questions are asked. So feel free to contribute them at any point. So Meg and I know each other. I think the nicheness of comics in Australia kind of means we all know each other inevitably. But I was trying to think how we met. And I remembered actually it was not through comics necessarily, but because we were both doing animation degrees at the University of Technology, Sydney. I was in the undergrad, you're in the master's. And we were actually both assistant teaching into the same class. But I think you were on Tuesdays and I was on Thursdays. And I was like, oh, who is this Meg O'Shea, who also does comics that I'm hearing about, who's also in an animation program. That is to say, like, you know, you don't only do comics, but you have kind of a well-rounded practice that touches on animation and design and printmaking. And I guess I was wondering how you think about that balance in your art practice, and sort of, do you think of yourself primarily as a cartoonist?
Yeah, definitely. Also, good memory about the days for the teaching stuff at UTS. Yeah, thank you for having me also. But yeah, I do consider myself primarily a comic maker now, just because that's the thing I've realized that I want to set aside space in my life to do. Um, but yeah, I do have that kind of like educational background in animation and also in sculpture. But yeah, I got introduced to comics like kind of properly for the first time during my animation degree, and just the enjoyment I got out of making them just completely like kind of threw comics animation out the window. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's a huge crossover between animators and comic makers. I think like they're such related, but I mean, I find that comics so much more achievable to do as a solo act.
Yeah.
I don't know if you feel the same way. It's like quite appealing.
Yeah,
And
definitely. Like that was actually a huge part of it, because having to knowing that like if you're working on an animation, you're likely going to have to work with other people, and I'm very bad at organization, and just like the feeling of like maybe letting other people in your team down or something like that. But also like the immediacy of comics, like particularly with the content of a lot of the stuff that I make, it's something that I tend to want to like get out very quickly as well. And just is a space that I'm really happy to work in, because it's all kind of within my own control, my own decision making. Kind of sounds weird. Yeah.
yeah, no, controlling behavior is, I think, normal for most, I find.
Yeah.
But on that topic of your work, students from this term of Toolkits have read some of your comics, but maybe for a wider audience viewing tonight's session, how would you maybe characterize your work or your sort of point of view in comics?
Yeah, so I make mostly autobiographical work, as I think you mentioned in the kind of intro blurb thing, about being a Korean adoptee and stuff to do with that. So I'm often working with topics that can be like very complex or emotional. Um, but it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to say whether I'm doing this successfully, but the way the way I'd like my work to be is hopefully like kind of relatively accessible despite the content, and you know maybe not overly emotional, maybe more about emotional topics rather than an emotional work, and maybe something just people feel comfortable sitting with mostly. Also jokes occasionally, hopefully. Yeah.
Well, I feel like it's not quite journalistic, but I mean, you'll be telling us about very personal things, but there is this slight, like there's a narrative voice sort of leading us, and there's a sense, it's not as if, it has this immediacy on the one hand, but it's not as if we're in the story of you, the character, kind of, you're kind of dissecting things for us. And I think like, this is how I see a lot of the work anyway. You're like, as you say, the emotion is there, but it's not it's like, we're kind of being led through your thinking in a way that I think is successful in that regard, like is very approachable, and you can kind of immerse yourself in it and really understand where you're coming from.
Thank you for saying that. Like, I do. I guess I do kind of think of it as like, presenting people with the materials they need to like understand what like conclusions or feelings or whatever I've been trying to get across, but like leaving it up to them. So thank you. That's nice.
The work is very good. If you haven't seen Meg's work before, maybe I wanted to circle around to, you said you got really into comics while you were studying. who are your guys? What particular artists did you sort of get into at that time?
Yeah. So one person whose work I got into was the teacher for that subject. So that's Pat Grant. So he part of the thing that like was I found so good about that class was that as like a practicing comic maker, he could bring in his work at different stages and just kind of show us very clearly how he'd approach things. Also kind of just breaking things down in a way that I hadn't kind of intuited otherwise from, anything else I'd come across before that. And, admittedly, most of the stuff I'd read before that was probably like reading Mad magazine when I was in like primary school or something like that. So it was good to kind of understand the mechanics of that better and like also get introduced to other artists. Like one of the first comics I read that made a huge impact on me was Chris Ware's Building Stories, because I was personally very into architecture, but just I guess like again having these like very emotional stories like at a distance was something that appealed to me, and the fact that like almost completely destroyed me um, was like kind of showed me how powerful comics could be, and also just he works so obviously with the form and that kind of thing. It kind of blew my mind, so that was a big one for me.
So you want to give people the tools to destroy themselves. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I don't want to be responsible for that directly. Like, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've thought about this a lot before. I think like the kind of comics, you know, subgenre that I think, you and I are maybe in this work that kind of comes out of maybe more sort of like self-publishing, zine culture, but also I think is a result of having multiple sort of art interests, like your interest in sculpture, animation, architecture. Like I think for me, the most interesting comics being made right now are usually by artists that kind of straddle like a few different mediums that they're really interested in and bring that, whatever the visual lessons of those mediums, bring them into the actual practice of making. And I feel like you exemplify that in a lot of ways. Your pages are very interestingly designed. You're often, you don't work with like a rigid panel structure very often, for instance. Like, you have these quite flexible layouts that, are doing double service, creating these like big, interesting moments that, go beyond what could be fit in a panel. And they also look very beautiful and balanced on the page. And I guess, I don't know if I even have a question attached to this. Maybe I just wanted to say that. But I think for me, that's
I'm happy to hear it. Thank you.
That's one of the stronger, the things that stands out to me about your work visually is that there's this sense of there's like other visual thinking that's not regurgitating comics visual thinking, if that makes sense. Like you're coming from these different places that I think then gives the form something new and interesting. And to me, that's, I prefer comics artists that are sort of breaking new ground in that way.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Like just looking at people's practices, because I guess like if you think about what is considered the kind of standard approach to comics, if you want a very comicsy comics approach or whatever, not good. Like it is very kind of like restrictive and kind of comes from the idea of kind of studio comics, and which is like a very kind of set thing based on a certain like commercial model and that kind of thing. So yeah.
And that's also a model that is collaborative,
Mm.
which I think is the other interesting point of difference between maybe the kind of comics that we're interested in and that I think a lot of those students in Toolkits I find are interested in versus mainstream work is that I think one of the more cool, maybe undervalued aspects of comics is that it is a medium that it's not easy to work in, but you can make a whole book by yourself. You can make this whole, visual presentation and narrative yourself. And so it can really be one person's vision in a way that I think that's why you get such striking, weird and strange comics in that kind of alternative comics niche. And to that point, I'd be interested to know sort of what your pipeline looks like when you work on comics. Like, how do you go from idea to the finished page?
Yeah. So my approach kind of depends. It depends. Just just in general, I'm motivated a lot by like just the things that have played on my mind, that have been playing on my mind so much, and I'm like, oh, I have to communicate this somehow, or I have to get it out of my head. So that I think like oftentimes in my head that is like verbal as well, like it's as words. So I'll begin with like some sort of scripting stage, depending on what exactly the topic is, like that might involve some level of research as well. So I'll do one brain vomit version. It's probably got a bunch of asterisks in it telling me, oh, I have to look that up to make sure I'm not just like pulling that out of thin air, or like, just to confirm my suspicions around it or whatever. And yeah, normally I try and do that on paper, so I'm not like going back and editing or like backspacing a bunch. And then I'll go on to reading. I'll do like probably way too much reading. I'll like shoehorn in like a bunch of new facts and stuff I found if it's the sort of comic that's about that. And then as I'm writing, if any ideas for imagery come up at the same time, I'll just take note of them. And then I guess like after a few rounds of that, breaking whatever text I have up into pages, just like normally suggested by how like the rhythm of how I phrase things, or like topics that I think are kind of like a more self-contained thing that might belong in the page together. And then when it comes to making imagery, like the actual image making, that also depends a lot. I don't often thumbnail that much. I do occasionally, but mostly it's kind of limited to like, practicing drawing a couple of things on a separate piece of paper, and then going straight onto penciling with like just a blue lead pacer, and then just going straight over the top with a felt tip. It's just like a uniball because I press too hard and I just destroy all my other pens. Uni pins, sorry, shit. And yeah, then just like scanning, cleaning up, and then like coloring hell in Photoshop. I was actually going through my stuff when you sent the questions through before. And one of the things about the layouts that I do occasionally do as well if I do thumbnail is just like kind of block out areas. If I'm thinking of like a 2-page spread, I'll like block out areas with color where I know like it'd be good to have like denser detail or something like that to balance it out. But it's not something I do that frequently. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. I feel like I should do it more to get into the habit, but
Well, I think maybe, I mean, like taking Chris Ware as a counterpoint, like Chris Ware, to me, I also like his work. And if anybody's seen it, it's quite, he works on these like on a gigantic scale. and there's so much detail and precision, which on one hand is great. But then when I think about your work, I think there's similar design thinking happening, but it's also more organic. And maybe that is you know what I mean? Like maybe that is a benefit of not being like too rigid about the planning. Because I imagine that, yeah, I don't know. I wonder if your work would flow the same way if it was more stridently kind of planned.
Yeah, like I have noticed when I do try and put more intensive planning into stuff, I like what I produce less because it does feel kind of, it ends up rigid and overworked. Yeah, I think one of the things that's kind of maybe carried over from like having worked in sculpture, where I was just, constructing things a lot and just like moving stuff around with my hands to see like where it'd go all right. It's like, I can't remember how I began this sentence. Just like like kind of like instinctively assembling shit on a page.
Yeah, is the analogous kind of
Yeah.
approach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing that
I should be swearing.
I think you're okay.
Okay.
I have to get Express Media to let us know in the chat if it's okay. But I think young adult audience. Okay.
Yeah.
But one other thing that it is okay. Thank you. One other thing that I think about when I think about your work, because I'm often seeing it at zine fairs, is the attention to like crafting a physical book that you put in. Like, you especially specialize in these really tiny, little, lovely, mini zines. And I kind of wanted to talk to you about, I don't know, your feelings about crafting books and making physical objects. Like I get the impression it's something you quite like, part of the process that you like. Is that the case?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like part of the reason why I end up turning my work into zines a lot of the time is because I've wanted to just experiment with some sort of material with my hands that isn't just drawing. I really love like the kind of practical design challenges that can come out of like both making a book and like working with different sorts of binding, but also working how to like do that kind of efficiently and en masse enough to sell like 10 zines at a zine fair or whatever. But yeah, it's an element of it I find like very enjoyable, and also like gives me a way to like approach my image making more thoughtfully as well, if I'm considering it as part of like a final three-dimensional product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess I was wondering, how do you feel about zine fairs generally? Are they sources of great anxiety, or are they maybe, or are they nice community moments?
Definitely both sources of anxiety and nice community moments. Like, I don't know, like so many of the connections I've made through the earliest zine fairs I went to are still ones that I have now. Also, like, I mean, obviously it's like a fantastic way to, give work to a broad audience and like try stuff out and see what sticks and that kind of thing. And that's another way to, make connections with people. Also the fact that they provide a deadline, like you'll spend so much of your day at a zine fair just talking about like, oh, how many hours of sleep did you get last night? Because you knew everyone's been up binding the night before. I do also, I don't know, I don't know if it's just like an age thing or what, but like I have been finding them increasingly overwhelming lately. like, I don't know, it's I've had a real sense of like how long I've been going to zine fairs now recently. Like at the last zine fair I went to, I ran into the person I tabled with at my very first zine fair in 2015, and he had this like kid who was a high schooler that like I think was a small child before, and it just kind of was a bit of a wig out. And yeah, yeah, yeah. Also, yeah, I don't know. I feel like the sort of content you get at zine fairs now is like quite different, and the fact that it is noticeably different also wigs me out because I have to accept the passage of time and that kind of thing.
Yeah, how do you think it's changed? Because I agree. I've been going to zine fairs in Australia for like 10 years, and I've definitely seen changes. But how would you?
I think I think maybe just because of the availability of like on-demand print services or like, you know, inexpensive color printing or a number of other things that tends to be a greater number of like kind of design orientated stuff or designy stuff or like, you know, more things like, you know, photo zines than there used to be. Not not sure why that is. Maybe in Sydney because so many people are coming through BizCom where they're learning how to design and make books into the zine fair or something. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think I tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you also come from this kind of like political side of zine culture, maybe, or like have a good understanding and appreciation of, the side of zine culture that is more about, sort of ideas around radical politics and like creating this system of trading information that's sits out, is totally independent of any structures. And I think that vein of the zine fair, it's like it's always there, but it kind of like waxes and wanes. How much of that kind of content is present at any given fair?
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely seen kind of more people making that work just relegated to one or two tables distributed around the zine fair now.
And I think your work has reflections of that, though. Like it is very political. Your work, most of it, I would say, in that sort of sense of like the personal is political. Like you use yourself as the basis for then talking about these structures and things that are wider and, as you say, quite can be quite complex and emotional and like I think like I don't know how you feel about the politics of your comics and if it's something that um, that you're kind of very conscious of when you're writing work or
yeah, honestly, like that is a big motivator for a lot of, well, not a lot of, but like most of the stuff I make to do with adoption is definitely politically motivated. Like just I guess like just through my own process of like looking into my own personal history, realizing that, you know, there are all of these like economic and social and historical elements to it that I didn't know about as someone directly affected by this, that are also like the results of, you know, even broader things like US imperialism or like, you know, the relationship of like, you know, developed countries blah blah blah. The fact that I had no idea about that kind of motivates me to make work that can also step other people through that and kind of like understand the the complexity of not just that, but other things it relates to more. Don't know if I'm expressing that very well.
Definitely.
But yes,
yeah.
my main agenda is to trick everyone into agreeing with my views.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think you do a good job of it.
Thank you.
With everything I've seen you write. And coming from a place of no understanding as well about like many of the dynamics around, adoption. And would you want to talk about the work that you're working on now? And
yeah, so I've been trying to work on a long film autobiographical work for maybe like 8 years now. I became interested in my personal adoption history around the same time I started making comics. Well, really getting into comics. And realized, there was like it was a good way to communicate that kind of thing. But the more I looked into adoption related stuff, the more I realized I had left to learn. So that 8 years has basically been a very involved research phase, if you could call it that, which, basically involved me like going to live in Korea to work stuff out, like, meeting and, hanging out with, for the first time, really other adoptees to find more stuff out, like, looking into all of this history that I had no idea about. But I am actually at a point now where I feel like I can write about it in some sort of way that will feel comprehensive enough to me, but also will be comprehensible enough because I've reached a certain point with it emotionally as well. Also, yeah, just, yeah, kind of, I don't know, I guess it's like with most creative projects, also like reaching a point where you like have to call things and be like, oh, I just have to do this now. This is getting ridiculous. Yeah.
well, what it might be a good chance to pivot actually to talking a little bit about the comics art workshop. Because am I right that you probably first workshopped that book at some stage at one of those retreats? Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I brought the first version of kind of any of that project to the last comic art workshop uh at the end of last year. So the comic art workshop it's the main thing it is kind of like a 2-week residency for comic artists. You're completely frozen, but I'm presuming you're still there.
I am still here. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. Yeah, it's a 2-week residency for comic artists where about like 14 comic artists with bigger projects go out into a remote area, and each have like a dedicated intensive workshop session of their project, but also like you get to like kind of form relationships with people by basically just like living together for 2 weeks as well, which is like really nice. I can't remember what the question was. I'm so sorry.
Well, I just wanted you to talk about, because I think CAW, which is the acronym, is a really interesting experiment that sort of doesn't, I don't know of anything comparable in Australia in so far as offering that kind of opportunity. I think prose writing gets those there are multiple prose retreats and things like that. And so I think just hearing a little bit more about it and your kind of experience being a participant, but also you now, along with Finn McCabe, are taking the reins of running the program. And so I'd be interested to hear like what your kind of goals are.
As an organizer, my main goals are feeding people, but also
Practical.
just
Sorry, practical.
Yeah. But also I guess like a big part of core, I think, is the kind of vulnerability it maybe not encourages, but kind of provides ample space for, just by virtue of the fact that, like, there are, like you said, there are so few opportunities like this in Australia for like rigorous workshopping of comic works, but also just like being around so many specifically comic makers for an extended period. So like you as a comic maker, you've probably been working on this thing in isolation for ages, and you've got like this little precious messed up baby, and suddenly you're like exposing it to a group of people who you may not know at all. And I think like a very important part of that is like cultivating like a very like welcoming and safe space for that to happen, because yeah, like comics I've kind of found tend to be things that like people arrive at by themselves. You can come from like any number of different directions and like end up at like an incredibly personal and specific comic practice. And just like I forgot where I was going with that. No, I'm starting to trail off. Oh my god, I was going so well. Sorry.
Well, I would ask, like, what do you think, like, as then a participant, like, how did you find the process of, in that sort of intimate environment, being vulnerable and showing your weird eraserhead baby of a project? Like, how did you find that that feedback? Because I think that is the thing that I think maybe you were getting at, in terms of like, it's so the work is so not, no matter what you're doing as a comics artist, whether it's autobi or not, in your case, it is, so it's personal on that level, but it's also personal in terms of, it's your perspective, and it may be radically different from somebody else that's at the retreat. But yeah, how do you feel like that feedback process has changed your work?
Yeah. It was so what I brought with me wasn't, it actually had like kind of minimal anything that looked like a finished comic page. So it was mostly written stuff. But the feedback I got from it in terms of like just people kind of understanding and seeing value in the things I'd chosen to include was incredibly gratifying, and just like very, very helpful. Like, I don't know, like when I feel like if you end up making a big comic project, it's probably about something you care about a lot, because, comics are so incredibly labor intensive and like frequently thankless. Why else would you want to spend time on them unless it was about something you saw a lot of value in? So just being in a space where everyone kind of understood that about each other and was willing to like, bring as much of themselves and their knowledge and everything that they learned from whatever weird path they'd come through to end up making comics, just bringing that to everyone's projects, like regardless of, you know, what they were about, or like, you know, how they were being made or what stage they were at, was just incredibly gratifying and like incredibly educational for me, just seeing the way everyone's brains worked with this stuff, and just, you know, just seeing that there are other people like so committed to these things that they cared about, which is nice. People caring about stuff's good.
Well, to piggyback off of the point you brought up about comics work being thankless, I am curious. I think people are often curious about how comics artists make money. And the answer I found is almost never from comics. So without being too gauche, can I ask you, how do you make money? How do you make like a living? And you know, what are the kind of ways that you use your art practice to do that?
Yeah, so my main source of income is very comics related. It's the research project, the research assistant work you mentioned before. It's for a project that's basically looking and like trying to make, the main thing is to make like an accessible resource about contemporary Australian comics through kind of interviewing people and getting them to kind of bring in into like objects and stuff from their personal history in Australian comics, and basically talking about their personal experiences. So that's been my main source of income for like the last year and a half, maybe. Um, in addition to that, like, you know, I occasionally get commissions for comic work, and kind of less occasionally illustration work. Um, I used to do more freelance work, but I don't know. I've realized if I can afford to give myself the space just to work on my own project that I'm invested in, it's kind of more worth it than to do that. But yeah, that is the sort of thing I don't think I would have been able to do without the other kind of steady income. And yeah, before the research project as well, I was making kind of partially animated videos for an education company. So that was the thing that was supporting my practice through that. So the day job stuff. Oh, also like occasional workshops and teaching, like at UTS, like you mentioned. But yeah, never.
Yeah, I feel like
Yeah.
that's a very typical kind of like, I know it's typical of this age in general that people have multiple jobs, but I think being any kind of arts practitioner, you're more and more likely to be, you know, divided into like 5, 6 jobs kind of at once that you're juggling.
Yeah.
But on that point about the research project, so that's Folio, which is a sort of brings in different universities, right, are engaged in this project of documenting the Australian kind of comics landscape. I'm interested in, because from what I've heard, Folio is really like, you know, tracing back to you know, any sort of living cartoonists in Australia and finding these like deep connections. And I guess I'm maybe interested in hearing you talk about that a little bit, if there have been some like illuminating or interesting, you know, things that have come up as part of your, you know, being a research assistant in that project.
Yeah. So the main area of focus for the project is comics or comic makers who've been working like from about the 80s to now. And part of the motivation behind it was to kind of get representative people from like significant areas of comics, not just in terms of like, you know, genre, that kind of thing, but also like in terms of, you know, creators and their backgrounds and that sort of thing as well. So yeah, that's been part of the motivation was was like the fact that it's really difficult to get a handle or an overview of kind of the broader comics scene in Australia, because, you know, there's no real formal structure there. Like you might start making stuff and go to a zine fair and meet people who become your friends, who introduce you to their friends and that kind of thing. And that'll so many of the like the access points into knowing stuff will be through personal connections. So for me, like, yeah, my circle is like very, like, my personal circle has been very defined by zine fairs and you know, being in Sydney and just stuff like that. But you know, being able to talk to, like, you know, people who were like working when you had to send away for zines, and you got you found out about zines in like a giant printed catalog, or, you know, even speaking to, you know, people like Campbell White and Liz, oh god, I can't say hello. Campbell and Liz of Milktooth Studio in Perth,
Yeah.
and learning about like how kind of the size of their comic scene there had like driven their desire to like build a comics community and all that kind of thing. It's given me a really good sense of like the kind of diversity of comic scenes around Australia, but also more of the history and how it's it's changed even in the last few decades. And yeah, also like just because we were talking about money as well, like how much of an impact like having external support for a comics practice is. There's like so many people who get brought up in conversations like, oh yeah, this person was really big, then they, you know, burnt out, or like then they got, you know, a job at this place and didn't have time to make things. Um, yeah, that's been good. It's not good. Interesting.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I feel like things are changing pretty rapidly in the, again, like kind of 10-year slice that I've been in Australia. Um, is that your impression as well, that things are like kind of changing at a pace that maybe is faster than previous decades?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think like you mentioned, you know, you talked to David yesterday, was it? Of like, yeah, like publishers like Scribe are, you know, taking on more comic work, and, you know, the fact that people like, you know, Safdar and Sam Wallman are kind of getting institutional recognition, I think I think kind of counters a lot of the risk adverseness that a lot of publishers in Australia seem to have. So yeah, that is pretty exciting. Like, it's exciting that, you know, it can be comics can be seen as like something viable, that publishers got the message that people actually want to read them, which is cool. Yeah.
Okay. So we've got 5 more minutes. I might pivot to, we've got a question in the chat. And if anybody else wants to add a question in, see if we can get to them. Alice is asking, have you always drawn in your style, or did you take time to develop it? And then did it, becoming an animator, change your comic craft?
Um, I don't know how I'd characterize my style. I like it. The way I draw now did take time to develop. I think like just being just through the process of making comics and, you know, learning how things to do with like my own patience with how long I want to sit with an image, or like with how I like want to get ink down on paper, kind of contributed to the style I draw in, but also just being exposed to a wider range of comics and kind of thinking about the things that make an impact on me and like wanting to replicate elements of that, is like a big thing that contributed to me like consciously changing my style to make it what it is right now. Um, and for the animation stuff, it contributed in as much as it made me realize that I really wanted to do comics more than anything else. Also, like, you know, with stuff like, you know, sculpture and illustration and all the other things I've previously done work in, um, I don't think I would have realized how important comics were to me, or like how good a fit they were if I hadn't done those before.
And piggybacking off that, we have a question. Who or what are your biggest influences?
Yeah. So again, early influence was Chris Ware, and Pat Grant, who are two very structural boys. Actually, when I started using a lot more, kind of like just like big areas of black and stuff, or like flat color, your work actually, yeah, was a big influence. I think like I also tend to be more into people who just like kind of flat colors and like kind of
graphic kind of style.
Sorry?
Like a graphic sort of style, is that?
Yeah. Yeah, so like Nick, oh god, I can never say it. Drasno?
No, I don't know. Nick Dranazo is what I say. Drso. But I have no clue if that's correct. But.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I guess like visual influence, like also Michael Ficaris, like Claude Acolyte. Oh no. I realized like I spend so much time like reading other people's names and not saying them.
I'm not saying them.
Crap.
We should have had a session beforehand going over it.
Oh my god. Oh, I'm getting so red and sweaty. I can say it. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And we've got one final question, which I think is all we'll have time for. Annie's asking, what are some challenges or blocks that come up in your creative practice, and how do you tackle these?
I think a lot of the time for me, motivation is a huge issue. You know, I very easily get sidetracked by other projects that I can get fully invested in, and you know, often I've like reached points where I'm thinking to myself, oh, maybe I'm not a comic maker. This is fine. Like, this is, you know, I'll learn how to make chairs. This like I'll learn different types of joinery. But I think like being around other comic makers, but also other people like friends I have in the adoptee community, just having proximity to that kind of reminds me of the main things that tend to motivate me when I make comics, which is sort of communicating things that are important to me at my core. Sounds quite cheesy. But yeah, I just like, I don't know. I think just trying to stay around things and conscious of the things that made me want to make comics in the first place.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Meg O'Shea. And thank you, everybody who's tuning in live and people to come to see this video in the future.
God.
I appreciate it a lot. Also a reminder that yes, this session will be available on YouTube as a resource, and it will be captioned in the coming days if you want to revisit it. If you've enjoyed this, please check out the archive of Toolkits live talks on the Express Media channel. There are lots of them. We have over 70, in fact, from different Toolkits guests across different mediums. And that's it. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.